In northern Tanzania, a wildlife biologist named Craig Packer spent 2 decades cataloging something nobody had bothered to track before: every recorded lion attack on a human being across the Rift Valley. More than 1,000 cases. Names, dates, locations, moon phases. And when he lined up the data by lunar cycle, the pattern made no sense. The nights everyone feared most, the nights when the moon hung full and bright over the savannah, were not the deadliest nights at all. The real danger arrived 8 to 10 days later, once the moon had started to shrink and rise later in the evening, leaving the early hours of dusk unexpectedly dark. People had spent generations dreading the wrong night. So why did fear attach itself to the full moon at all, if the full moon wasn't actually when the killing happened? You would think fear evolves to track real danger with precision. That's the assumption behind most survival instincts. A snake's shape in tall grass should trigger alarm because snakes are actually dangerous. A rustling sound at night should raise your heart rate because something might actually be approaching. Fear, in theory, calibrates itself against real consequences over enough generations. But Packer's data suggested something stranger. Early humans across many separate cultures, from the savannas of East Africa to the forests of Europe to the deserts of Australia, all converged on the same belief. Something about the full moon itself was unsafe. Not the darkness after it, not the specific week of highest predator activity. The full moon, glowing and impossible to ignore, became the villain in story after story, long before anyone could explain why. Packer published his findings in 2011, working with colleagues Alexandra Swanson and Dennis Ikonda, drawing on records that stretched back through Tanzania's Lindi region for more than 20 years. The mechanism turned out to be almost mathematical. A full moon rises at sunset and sets at sunrise, bathing the entire night in light. But every night after that, the moonrise slips later, sometimes by close to an hour. Within a week and a half, the moon isn't rising until well after dusk, which means the most dangerous hours for a human walking home, cooking over an open fire, or checking on livestock are suddenly unlit. Lions, which hunt more successfully in darkness, take advantage of exactly that window. The full moon wasn't the threat. It was the last bright night before a run of dark ones. And that distinction changes everything about how you understand the fear that followed it. Here's what doesn't add up, though. If the actual risk peaked over a week after the full moon, early human communities should have developed a delayed fear, a countdown that kicked in once the moon started fading. Instead, the fear attached itself immediately, at the moment of fullest brightness when visibility was at its best and danger was, statistically, at its lowest. What was actually happening in the human mind and body on those nights that made the full moon itself feel threatening? Two explanations sit side by side here, and neither one fully explains the other away. The first is simple: a direct physiological reaction to overwhelming brightness, something built into the nervous system long before language existed, no reasoning required. The second demands more: a form of pattern recognition passed down through generations, where communities learned, without ever measuring moonrise times, that the full moon marked the start of a dangerous stretch, and encoded that knowledge as instinctive dread rather than calculated timing. One requires almost nothing from the brain. The other requires memory, transmission, and something close to collective forecasting. The physiological half of the story has real support. Christian Kaiochen, a chronobiologist at the University of Basel, ran an experiment in 2013 that had nothing to do with predators at all. He put volunteers in a windowless sleep laboratory with no way to see the moon, no clocks, no clues about the date. And still, their sleep changed on a lunar schedule. Around the full moon, deep sleep activity, measured by EEG, dropped by roughly 30%. Melatonin levels fell. It took people about 5 minutes longer to fall asleep, and they slept, on average, 20 minutes less overall. None of them could see the moon. Their bodies tracked it anyway. That finding matters more than it first appears. If a full moon genuinely degrades sleep quality, even in a sealed room, then early humans sleeping in the open, fully exposed to actual moonlight, would have experienced something more intense: lighter sleep, more frequent waking, a body primed for vigilance rather than rest on exactly the nights when the landscape around them was lit up like a stage. That's not superstition, that's a nervous system responding to a real signal, whether or not the immediate threat matched the sensation. A second study adds a different layer entirely. In 2015, Jerome Siegel at UCLA led a research team studying sleep patterns in 3 pre-industrial societies still living without electric light: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia. Across all 3 groups, on nights with more moonlight, people went to bed close to half an hour later than usual, even without any calendar or lunar tracking device to guide them. Total sleep time shortened slightly. The effect was small, but it was consistent, and it showed up in populations living almost exactly the way humans lived for most of history. Put those 2 studies together, and a shape starts to emerge. On a full moon, you sleep less, more lightly, and later. Your body is, in a very real sense, awake when it shouldn't be. Add a predator's eye view of the savannah, and a full moon night becomes a night where humans are both highly visible and less rested than normal. A combination that would have felt dangerous even before the actual statistical risk arrived days later. Consider the accounts that come down through oral tradition. Kalahari sand trackers describe moving their fires closer together on bright nights, not because attacks were more common then, but because visibility cut both ways. Prey animals could see predators coming, and predators could see prey just as easily, creating a tense standoff that made everyone more alert, not less. In Aboriginal Australian storytelling, several groups describe spirit figures tied specifically to the full moon, entities blamed for restlessness and bad dreams rather than physical attack, an almost exact match for what Cahochin's sleep lab recorded centuries later using electrodes instead of legend. In parts of West Africa, some traditional accounts describe increased vigilance and shortened sleep, specifically timed to the full moon, with communities describing an inability to fully rest regardless of any confirmed threat nearby. Consider one more case, this time from the Arctic. Inuit hunting groups in northern Canada describe timing seal hunts around moon phase, not because of any predator threat, but because moonlight on snow and ice changes how far sound and movement carry across an open landscape. Bright nights meant a hunter could be seen from much further away by both prey and by the polar bears that sometimes followed hunting parties. Elders describe a heightened caution specifically on full moon nights, distinct from the caution used on ordinary dark nights, even though the actual bear encounters, like the lion attacks in Tanzania, tended to cluster in the darker nights that followed. There's also a modern echo of this pattern, recorded almost by accident. Hospital emergency departments have been studied repeatedly for a so-called lunar effect on human behavior, mood, and injury rates, and most of that research has failed to find any meaningful correlation. What several of those same studies did find, almost as a side note, was a small but consistent uptick in reported sleep disturbance and daytime fatigue in the days surrounding a full moon, matching almost exactly what Cahochin measured under laboratory conditions decades after Packer began cataloging lion attacks in Tanzania. The myth of moon madness collapsed under scrutiny. The sleep disruption underneath it did not. Move further out, and the pattern touches other species too. Dung beetles use polarized moonlight to navigate, and their flight patterns shift measurably around the full moon. Zooplankton in the ocean alter their vertical migration on a lunar cycle, staying deeper to avoid moonlit predators near the surface. Even coral spawning across the Great Barrier Reef synchronizes to specific lunar phases with startling precision. None of these organisms have culture, memory, or stories passed between generations. They are simply responding to light. Which raises the question of how much of the human fear was inherited biology and how much was layered culture built on top of that same older signal. And then there's the strangest threat of all. Packer's own data showed that lions weren't the only predator whose behavior shifted with the moon. Hyena attack patterns followed a similar lunar rhythm, and so did some recorded leopard encounters, each species independently adjusting its hunting schedule to the same lighting cycle that was disrupting human sleep at the exact same time. Two completely different animals hunting the same landscape, both recalibrating their behavior to a light source neither of them controlled, while the humans caught in between absorbed the tension of both patterns without ever measuring either one directly. You cannot interview a Paleolithic human about why they feared a particular night. There's no way to recover the exact moment fear of the full moon first attached itself to a specific story, a specific god, a specific warning passed from an elder to a child. Researchers are still actively debating how much of this fear was hardwired through shared physiology versus assembled independently by hundreds of separate cultures noticing the same pattern and drawing their own conclusions. It's also worth noting that not every culture feared the full moon in the same way. Some traditions treated it as a night for gathering, storytelling, or travel, precisely because visibility was highest and the ordinary threats of stumbling in the dark were temporarily reduced. That variation matters. It suggests the fear wasn't a single fixed instinct stamped onto every human brain the same way, but something closer to a shared raw material, a physiological nudge toward wakefulness and unease that different groups then shaped into different stories depending on their own predators, their own landscape, and their own history. But what the evidence does show is that the fear was never irrational. It was aimed at the wrong night, but built from a real signal, disrupted sleep, heightened visibility, and a landscape shared with predators who were adjusting to the exact same light. The full moon didn't cause the danger directly. It marked the beginning of a countdown that most people were never consciously aware of, a shift in light and rest that echoed all the way down to hormone levels, sleep architecture, and the hunting schedules of the animals sharing their territory. Go back to that stretch of Tanzanian savanna where Packer collected his data. The full moon rises, and for one night, the world is lit almost like daylight. People feel it in their sleep before they understand why. Days pass, the moon shrinks, rises later, and the darkness creeps back into the early evening hours when people are still outside, still moving, still exposed. That's when the lions come. The full moon was never the monster. It was the warning your body remembered long after your mind forgot what it was warning you about.